Hello and welcome everybody. It's 10 o'clock, so we'll make a start. I think more people join as we log in. Hello, my name is Ian Sullivan. I'm the Transfusion Lab Manager at the Royal Cornwall Hospital and Chair of the South West Transfusion Lab Managers Group. We welcome you to this training session on incident management hosted by the South West RTC. It's good to see so many attendees here. Numbers are going up, and also from different professional backgrounds, just not transfusion. Usual housekeeping rules applied on the screen there. Any IT issues, magic trick of just logging out of Teams and logging back in usually works. Any issues, contact Jackie, email address on the screen. Due to the number of attendees, camera phones and microphones have been switched off. At the end, there will be a feedback form to complete and an opportunity to download a CPD certificate. This session is being recorded and will be available on the PBM England YouTube channel. Any questions or comments you have throughout the session, please add them to the chat and I will raise them either during the session or at the end. So let me introduce you to Chris Robbie. For those who don't work in transfusion, he is a haemovigilance specialist at the MHRA, dealing with serious adverse reactions and events relating to blood transfusion. For those who don't work in the transfusion setting, any reactions or events relating to collection, storage, distribution, for example, that could affect the safety of blood have to be reported to the MHRA. These are also sent on to the Serious Hazards of Transfusion, SHOT, UK Haemovigilance Scheme. And as part of just raising these non-conformances, we must investigate them to implement effective corrective and preventative actions. Ultimately, is to learn from these errors to stop them happening again, thus improving patient safety. And on that note, I'll pass you over to Chris, who I'm hoping is logged on by now. Thank you very much and enjoy.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking me to talk today. Just want to say that this presentation is a version of one that I have done a few times. So if you've seen it, then I apologise, but yeah, it hopefully is worth a second look. I'll turn my camera off so you can concentrate on the slide. If you put questions into the chat, and Ian will interrupt me throughout to ask questions if there's any clarification needed. So yes, thank you very much for this. This is some training on root cause analysis and incident reporting. And as well as being part of being the MHRA's haemovigilance team, I'm also part of the SHOT working expert and steering groups. And so therefore I have a chapter which I write in their annual report, which hopefully some of you have read. So what we'll be covering today, I'll give you a little bit of background. Some information about why we investigate, what I see to be the investigation and reporting process. Then finally, we'll look into some categorization and some dummy data just to see what you can do with the data that you get. So the blood safety and quality regulations came into force in 2005. And it's a requirement from those regulations that all serious adverse events and serious adverse reactions must be reported to the competent authority, which is the MHRA. At that time, we also incorporated reporting to the Serious Hazards of Transfusion SHOT scheme, but it's a requirement of any total management quality system to have a method of reporting incidents so that you can learn from them.
Chris, I'm really sorry to interrupt. Have you managed to take control of the slide deck?
I thought so.
Is it moving on for people?
There should be on a slide called background.
Yeah, I've got slide 4, the content background, why do we investigate?
Okay, I should be on slide 5.
Yeah.
Have you taken control?
Are you on slide 5 now?
No, I'm still on 4.
Okay, sorry about this. How do I take control?
You should have an option on the bar at the top of the screen.
Apologies.
Top left, where you've got people chat, take control.
You're there.
Right.
Sorry about that.
Okay. Do you need me to start again?
No, please carry on where you left off.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry about that. I'm a novice at this sort of thing. So where was I? Yes, the tools which I'm going to present today aren't just for reporting serious adverse events and reactions to MHRA. You can use these tools for investigating any kind of incident, so non-serious incidents, health and safety incidents perhaps as well. We'll also be talking about the good practice guide for blood establishments and hospital blood banks, which you can find online, and they give guidance as to how to implement the blood safety and quality regulations. So why do we investigate? Normally I'd open this out to the audience, but obviously that's not appropriate today. So to my mind, the purpose of investigation is to correct mistakes and errors. We're also there to identify weaknesses in processes, to identify the root cause, and we want to make improvements to those processes through our corrective action. So we're learning from our mistakes, and we want to manage outcomes so that we can ensure safe blood component from a robust quality system and build future improvements into our quality management system. What we're not here to do is to blame individuals for any errors made. Hopefully what I will demonstrate to you is that even things that are traditionally thought of as being human error, we can still build improvements into the quality system that help prevent humans making errors. So you're probably familiar with these terms, but they do have specific meanings. So correction is to correct and to put right the error or event that's been identified. The corrective action is to ensure that that same mistake does not happen again. And preventive action is to prevent future or unknown errors yet to be made. So the example which I'll use throughout this presentation is a locum that's issued a non-irradiated red cell to a patient, and it turns out that the locum hasn't been trained in that particular process. So the correction therefore would be to recall units and issue the correct ones. The corrective action would be to train the locum in the correct procedure and identify any training gaps. But the preventive action would be to create an induction program that manages the training of all new members of staff. So this is a process flow diagram which demonstrates the investigation and reporting process. I'll go through each section in more detail throughout the presentation, but we'll start off with the error, which you need to assess the impact of, control that error and the effects of the error. You want to put in your correction and document and report as soon as possible. You want to assign an investigator who identifies weaknesses and gathers evidence so that you can provide your root cause and corrective action plan. And after we've created our incident report, we want to monitor and trend our incidents to identify future improvements. So we must have an incident reporting process, as I said, from any quality management system, and it must be documented in a standard operating procedure. It must include the methods of investigation, the reporting and use of investigation and reporting tools, such as the forms used, and it must meet the regulatory requirements of the blood safety and quality regulations. Throughout, as I said, I'll be referring to the good practice guide, and that section there, 1.2.13, most important part of that is highlighted. If the true root cause or causes of the issue cannot be determined, Consideration should be given to identifying the most likely root cause or causes and to addressing them. And I refer you to a bit of homework. Section 9 covers non-conformance and recall in detail. As I said before, these slides will cover any error, not just serious adverse events and reactions. We want to assess, when I was starting in the blood service back in the mid-1990s, we talked about the 4 Ps. That's people, plant, premises and procedures. So basically the errors can affect many different people, whether they're patients, members of staff, other people not yet involved. For example, if an error has occurred on a night shift when there's a lone worker, it may not be down to that member of staff. Could be something wrong with the quality system which could affect other members of staff on different days. It might affect your equipment, such as the limbs, storage equipment. It might involve the lab and the environment itself. It will involve your contingency plans and processes and all your policies and procedures that effectively make up your quality system. Any one of those can have an impact onto the error made and to the outcome of that error. You want to assess the impact of the error. It may be minor, serious or critical, and that may determine the level of investigation that you need to apply. There's some more slides on that. You want to assess the potential as well as the actual harm. That is a requirement of the blood safety and quality regulations. It tells us that we want to be investigating errors that might harm patients. So we need to consider patients outside of the actual error involved. And we may not have our errors occurring in isolation, and so therefore we need to prioritise how we investigate our incidents according to whether it's minor, serious or critical. Hopefully you'll be able to see this slide. Hopefully Jackie will be able to share the slides with you later, so you can look at these in a bit more detail outside of the presentation. But yes, we want to do a risk assessment. If we are looking at just actual harm, and you consider my example of a unit being issued with wrong specific requirements, it might be a one-off or a rare event, and it might have been spotted before the unit was administered, and therefore may not have resulted in harm. So if you do your risk assessment based on actual harm alone, you'll get perhaps a risk assessment that looks a bit like this, where you may assess a risk as being medium. But if we look at a risk assessment for potential harm, as we're required by blood safety quality regulations and the good practice guides, because it's already happened once, the likelihood is therefore increased. And even if the event didn't have any harm on the patient, if we issued the wrong blood to the wrong patient, it could have a fatal or catastrophic effect. And so therefore, we want to assess slightly higher than what we normally do. And that brings me on to the next few slides, where I want to explore the difference between the errors made and the outcomes. Quite often people will just focus on the outcome and try and put corrective action in that addresses that, rather than considering the error that's actually made. So I'm considering only blood safety and quality regulation errors here. I'm not considering clinical errors because that's outside the remit of the MHRA, but you can use this example within your own fields, as I said before. So consider 2 similar examples. Group A patient was mistakenly transfused with Group O blood, or Group A was patient was mistakenly issued with Group O blood, but it was identified at the bedside. What's the error? The error is actually the same. The error was selecting and issuing the incorrect unit. but the outcome was different. We transfused an incorrect group O to A. All the error was detected at the bedside, so the blood wasn't actually transfused. But because the blood was compatible, the actual harm was none. But the potential harm of the outcome was none in that case. But of the error, it's potentially fatal, because remember, if the same mistake had resulted in group B blood being issued to a group O patient, therefore it might have been a much more serious reaction that we would have to deal with. So don't just focus on the outcome of the error, focus on preventing the error from occurring in the first place. So back to our process. We want to control and limit the effects of the error and prevent further errors. So for our locum on his night shift, we may want to recall those non-irradiated red cells and also investigate if other components have been issued and recall them in case the same mistake happened before and we hadn't noticed it yet. We want to correct it. So we want to put that error right. We want to issue components to replace those that have been recalled. We want to document and report the error that's made. So locally, we want to do this as soon as possible to have a fresh recall of events with as much detail as possible so that people later on in the shift, people who are going to investigate, know exactly what's happened. If possible, evidence should be gathered before the end of the shift as directed by your instant SOP. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Where are we? What we have found is that many investigations are weak because evidence hasn't been gathered whilst it's fresh. Member of staff may have gone on annual leave, or they've gone sick, or they're on rest days, and we've waited until they've come back to gather information about the incident. After a period of time, they may have forgotten significant details. We also want to consider reporting externally. We want to be reporting to SHOT and Sabre as soon as known. That's a requirement and the wording from the blood safety and quality regulations. And what we take in practice is that that must be reported within 48 hours of the error having occurred. And we want full details, not just a few sentences, because what you need to remember is that members of staff from MHRA and SHOT have to understand your processes, your acronyms, that sort of thing. So put as much detail in as possible. We want to assign an investigator, and they need to have the relevant authority to investigate. The investigations may cover many different areas, such as the laboratory, clinical area. It may involve third parties. So they have to have the authority to be able to talk to and investigate with these other people. They need to have relevant experience. So not necessarily of the processes that went wrong. They need to have experience of investigation, asking the right questions of the right people to get the right information. So it's important that you expose your staff to training in this process and give them experience in how to investigate. They need to try and remain independent and objective of the error that's occurred. There may be some people investigating errors that they've made themselves, so they need to obviously remain objective and focused on the error made rather than their part in it, perhaps. And we want to assess the level of investigation. This slide's a little bit busy. As I said, you can look at it in detail later on. But essentially what we're saying here is that major and critical incidents may take longer to investigate than less serious incidents or observations. So although Sabre likes to have incidents reported back to us with corrective action within about a month, you don't have to wait a month for less serious incidents. Likewise, if an incident is quite complex, then that may take a bit longer. And so with the appropriate justification, you can extend your period of time for investigation. That slide, if you read it, has a bit more detail. What we find in SABRE reports reflects what we also find in the inspection findings. These next few comments here are common inspection findings that are raised at virtually every investigation and inspection that takes place. So the assessment of the incident root cause and kappa did not adequately reflect potential harm. The incidents reviewed showed insufficient evidence of an appropriate level of root cause and implementation of kappa. There was no justification for late closure of incidents. No formal process for requesting investigation extensions and the associated impact risk assessments. No justification for the allocation of incident investigation closeout times. SABRE reports not being made as soon as known, and no detailed trending of incidents. All of these deficiencies that are commonly found in inspections are referenced in the good practice guide underneath. So we want to identify witnesses. As I said before, these may be clinical area, laboratory people, third party, because it could be portering teams, or it may be taxi companies if you've got components that have been delivered to the wrong place. Gather evidence and facts. Consider all forms of evidence. They may be verbal accounts, records, either electronic or paper records, and you want to establish a timeline of what happened. I think this is a good part to mention reflective practices. I find that they're useful as part of the investigation because they highlight the human factors which need to be addressed as corrective and preventive action. However, quite often we will see reflective practices being issued as part of the corrective action. Now, what you do is that you risk overlooking system improvements, and it places unnecessary responsibility on the individual who made the error. As I said, your errors may have happened during loan working periods, so it may be a good idea to get information from other people that work that same shift, so that you can identify your system improvements from their reflections of what happened, rather than using it as punishment for having made an error. So root cause analysis and corrective and preventive action. This section of the good practice guide, the important bit here is identified or highlighted. Where human error is suspected or identified as the cause, this should be justified having taken care to ensure that process, procedural or system-based errors or problems have not been overlooked. So this ties in with what I said about reflective practices. We're not here to blame individuals for their part. We want to look at why it is that they made a mistake and what we can do to the quality system to improve it. It may well have been due to a slip or lapse in concentration, and therefore that would be justified. But if their slip or lapse in concentration was due to perhaps distraction or cutting corners because of workload, or because they were working too hard because of low staffing numbers, they are all parts of the quality system that are failing, that need to be improved, rather than blaming the individual for having not been vigilant. So it's important to determine not just how things happen, but why. It helps understanding the weaknesses of the quality system and identifying improvements. It can have many levels, and it may identify a number of root causes and factors involved. Importance of root cause analysis. It can be a team approach, as I said. just because the error occurred with one person, other members of the team may have some help and information about why the error might have occurred. We want to identify human factors. Now, they are all the factors involved that affect the individual, the task or process, and perhaps the organisation. Human factors isn't just a fancy new term for human error. So they can be any factor that affects the behaviour of the human. So human factors affect human behaviour, and that results either in a successful outcome or a failure. So those factors, as I said, aren't just what makes the individual an individual, such as their personality, their perception of risk. It's also about how the process is designed, about the quality of the instructions, about workload, about environment, etc., etc. All those things affect human behaviour and whether you get a successful outcome or not. We can also use this approach in dealing with other things such as equipment failures. If you consider a fridge failure due to the condenser failing, you may just assess that as being an equipment failure. But if you take a human factors approach, you may uncover the fact that the preventive maintenance schedule is too long, and perhaps if you shorten that by 6 months, you can prevent the condenser from failing in the first place. This presentation isn't here to tell you how to investigate or what tools to use. There are many different tools that are available, but in principle, they all want to achieve the same goal: identifying the causal factors, the contributory factors, any communication failures, and the root causes, i.e. something that, if it was removed from the error, will eliminate the problem. As I said, every error may have multiple factors involved, which may involve multiple causes, multiple improvements. They all need to be addressed. I'll let the ladies sit down. So, as I say, it's not important what tool you use. You could use any or a combination. It's not important necessarily to identify whether they're causal, communication, or root causes. Every factor needs to be addressed. If you haven't understood why an error occurred, your root cause analysis has not been as successful, because and therefore you can't target your corrective and preventive action to eliminating that problem. As I said, there may be multiple factors. It may involve a number of investigations, and you may have a number of corrective actions as a result of it. So this again comes back to my example of your locum issuing the incorrect blood. You want to identify the outcome. So the patient was transfused with non-irradiated blood. You want to identify the first error. Non-irradiated blood was issued. Why did that occur? Because the wrong component was selected. And there may be many steps between the first mistake and the error, and between the error and the outcome. And you want to map all of those steps to build up your timeline. So in this example, the request forms and the limbs should have been checked for the requirements. The correct blood should have been selected. The limbs should have detected the error. The error wasn't picked up after the blood was issued. It wasn't picked up when the blood was taken to the fridge. It wasn't identified at collection, and it wasn't identified at administration. So those are a number of errors that have occurred throughout the timeline, and it may be that those are certain points within your process that you can identify and improve. So we're now looking at what went wrong and how it went wrong. So the limbs and the form wasn't checked because those checks were admitted. The correct blood wasn't selected because the BMS didn't realise that irradiated blood was required, so they selected non-irradiated blood. The limbs didn't detect the error because there was no flag placed on the limbs. Checks on the issued blood were not successful when placing the unit in the fridge because those checks were omitted. The porter didn't detect the error because the porter didn't check for the special requirements on the collection form. And the error wasn't detected at administration because those checks weren't thorough. If we only apply that level of investigation, identifying what went wrong and how it went wrong, we might conclude that the root cause was procedure wasn't followed. But is that right? Well, because we haven't determined why it went wrong, no, we haven't got to the true root cause. We need to ask the people involved why they didn't perform the tasks as it was expected that they do so. So if we ask why, limbs and the forms checks were omitted, they were rushed due to workload. Now, I think I must state here, I'm not expecting everything to go wrong if something like this was reported, but these are all common errors that are made for similar types of reports. So not all of these may have gone wrong in your incident. The BMS didn't realise that irradiated blood was required, so they selected non-irradiated blood. Perhaps the special requirements weren't clear. There was no flag placed on the limbs, and perhaps there was no formal procedure to update the limbs with clinical information. Checks of the issued blood were omitted, again rushing to complete the order as there was a backlog of outstanding work due to understaffing. The porter didn't check for the special requirements because although it was in the SOP, the training material did not cover checking special requirements whilst they were training the porter. And that checks at the administration weren't thorough enough because the nurse involved was unclear what checks were required as there was no SOP with clear instructions. So instead of making staff responsible for the errors or mistakes that they've made, we've identified a number of areas in the quality system that could be improved, and that affects staffing and workload, training, SOPs and other documentation, and the processes and procedures themselves. So the next few slides, you may have seen before. I've presented it at SHOT symposiums before, and it's been a part of this presentation for a while, but they help me to go through a process when I'm reading a serious adverse event report, just to make sure that people have gone through the right steps during the investigation. So the first question you might want to ask yourself is, was this error a direct result of any change that's been made? If not, then there's a process flow diagram, which we'll look at in a minute. If it was a result of a change, was that change formally managed by the change control process? Sometimes even minor changes need to be controlled and need to be managed formally. So if you haven't got a formal change management process, you will need to have one. Were the plans robust or adequate? If not, you may need to improve the change management process and redo the validation plan. Were the plans followed correctly? If not, you may need to redo the change to make sure that you get the right outcome. The next slide looks at the process. Is there a defined process that covers the root cause of the error? If not, then you need to design a process that defines all the critical steps. Again, even some of the most simple processes need to be properly designed, and it needs to be fully described in an SOP that covers all the steps with clear instructions that cover all scenarios. So therefore, you may need in your SOP to cover, well, what happens if it goes slightly wrong? What do we do then? May not be written in that one SOP, but you can direct people to other SOPs and other documentation that help to explain different scenarios. Is there training? And is there assessment material that covers that process? If not, you need to design training and assessment material, so you can prove and demonstrate that your staff are competent. Have they been trained? If not, obviously you need to train that member of staff. Sometimes errors are made by staff that are in training, and that therefore may highlight issues with their training, but it also highlights part of the process in terms of how that member of staff is supervised. And therefore, if they're not being supervised effectively, then you may need to revise your supervision arrangements. Is further training required? Perhaps they hadn't understood the training, therefore you need to go through steps for the individual. Did the individual deliberately deviate from the accepted procedure? If they did they take an unacceptable risk or deliberately ignore the procedure? If they did, you may need to consider retraining or, unfortunately, formal proceedings if they persistently break the rules. Did the individual follow an incorrect procedure or miss steps in the process? They may have made a deviation because they were using their professional judgment. So, for example, if you accepted a sample and you have a 0 tolerance on samples, it may well be that they were doing that in the best interest of the patient because blood was required urgently. So, although we would advise against people from deviating from procedures, if it's necessary, you do have to have formal process deviation process so you can manage deviations when it is clinically required. You may need to consider if the process, the SOP, or the training needs to be redesigned to improve staff performance. Or the member of staff may have followed the correct procedure but made an incorrect decision. So you may want to consider if staff have access to sufficient support and information to help the decision-making process. The next slides are about the environment. So do you have a capacity plan? Your capacity plan needs to define the minimum staffing levels, the skill mix, and the expected workloads. Was the department sufficiently staffed when the error was made? If not, then you do need to address staffing problems. Consider the skill mix and the workload. And I'm, sitting in my ivory towers at MHRA, I'm not unaware of the particular problems that every lab is going through in terms of staffing and workload and the quality of people available. So you may not necessarily be able to just simply employ more staff, but you may need to consider how you schedule staff onto the rotas, how you devise your plan for completing the workload. So there may be things that you can consider there. Consider whether how you build breaks into the rotas so you don't have too many staff taking a break at the same time. Consider things like that if you can't simply address staffing problems with extra staff. Was the workload above what you'd normally expect? Then you may need to consider addressing a process and workflows. Was the skill mix of staff appropriate according to your capacity plan? You may have the right number of staff, but if you've got several staff in training, you may not have the right level of skills available on that shift. So you may need to consider how you train people and how you plan staff on any particular time of day. Was the staff member distracted? You consider all possible distractions and look either to eliminate those distractions or manage those distractions. Train staff to deal with distractions, including starting again and empowering staff to ask for help. So, speaking specifically about distractions, if distraction is identified as a causal factor, then it needs to be addressed. Try and eliminate it or reduce it or train staff to cope. One example that I had with a hospital was member of staff was issuing blood and was distracted by answering the phone. I contacted the reporter and said, Or did they actually need to answer the phone? What was more important, the phone call or the blood for the patient that they were working on urgently? And it turns out that the reporter was saying, actually, thank you for asking that question. This happened out of hours. There shouldn't have been any phone calls into the laboratory. We have a bleep service. There are computer systems that the clinical staff can use to check results and the location of blood, etc., etc. And so rather than blaming the member staff for having made a slip or lapse in issuing that blood, they're able to re-educate the clinical areas about when it was appropriate to telephone the lab, when it was appropriate to use the other services available. So back to our example, we can identify a number of different corrective and preventive actions. So review the capacity plan to determine the minimum staff levels that are appropriate. Make a business case for additional staff based on the requirements of an updated capacity plan. Or you might want to redesign staff rotas so fewer people can take breaks or annual leave at the same time. Examine workflows and balance against the staffing levels. Looking at training, excuse me. Update training records of porters to include the missing steps in the collection process. Once you've updated the training, you therefore need to retrain the porters in the updated process. Preventive action may be to review and update other training material. Update good practice training to include the effects of rushing, making sure staff get it right first time, and areas of distraction management. CAPA relating to SOPs and procedures. You may need to redesign the request form to make the specific requirements more visible. You might want to write an SOP for administering blood that gives clear step-by-step instructions as to how to administer a unit of blood. You want to review all processes to ensure that they are covered by SOPs. You also want to design a process to update the LIMS with specific requirements from clinical areas. So we've identified 11 improvements to the quality management system, and none of those actions were retraining because a member of staff didn't follow procedure. When I'm looking at reports, you also want to avoid unfinished corrective action. For example, quite often see, ask the supplier if it's possible, or our corrective action will be to review the SOP, or we will carry out an audit. All those actions are incomplete and haven't told me that you've identified the root causes within your process and areas of improvement. So better corrective action would be the supplier was contacted and the change will be introduced following the change control and validation. The SOP was reviewed and the following changes will be implemented. An audit was conducted into the process, and as a result, the following amendments to the process were made. So those, although the actual final corrective actions have yet to be implemented, you have at least identified the weaknesses in the quality system and that you are proposing your corrective and preventive action. And that's all that is required from a SABRE report, is that you give me your proposed corrective and preventive action. It's then up to you to go and implement that and monitor the progress through your own quality system. So back to slide whatever it was, where I said information needs to be reported as soon as known. Also, with your corrective action, put that in as soon as you know it, and I can close the SABRE report. I'm conscious that the lady doing the sign language is, so I will pause at that point.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I noticed that. I think just going to re-enable the camera again.
Ian, have you got any questions at this stage?
Yeah, people, please stick them into the chat if you have any comments. Yeah, more so a couple for at the end. There's one you came across earlier, because at the moment you make it sound so easy, nice, calm. You do investigation, wonderful capper there, but you did mention earlier that we need to record one incident was not closed within a target date. which whether it's a 1 week or 30 days. How would you recommend people do that? Like a mini risk assessment approved locally?
Yes, the idea is that inspectors don't want to see corrective actions that are just extended over many weeks or even months and months, simply because you hadn't got round to investigating or you hadn't got all the information from people. So, but it may well be that you've got a very complicated incident that needs to be. So yes, do a risk assessment, assess the risk of having not completed it. You may want to identify, if you hadn't already, the workaround to the particular problem that will prevent that error. But yes, as long as you have some kind of justification within your quality system as to why you haven't been able to close out an incident within the set period of time, then hopefully, as I say, with justification, that's acceptable.
Thank you. Yeah, Beth and Emily, you've got your hand up. Is your camera, is it working again now? Look at chat. Not yet. Okay, still troubles with that one. Have you tried logging, magic IT trick of logging back out, Teams logging back in, see if that works? While they're doing that, Chris, another question for you. Obviously, yeah, we should be grading on potential harm, potential risks. Do you come across many sites where sort of hospitals are struggling, where the labs, transfusion labs, will do potential, but the actual hospital only does actual harm, and they have these conflicts here? Have you come across that?
Yes, unfortunately, we have, and all I can offer is that the blood safety and quality regulations are written into law. It tells us that we have to consider the effects of errors that might harm a patient. And the responsibility for ensuring compliance with the blood safety and quality regulations, the words say the person responsible for the management of the hospital blood bank. Now, that doesn't mean the hospital blood bank manager or the transfusion lab manager or equivalent. That's talking about senior executive management. So the chief executive has legal responsibility. Chief executive of each trust has legal responsibility for the implementation of the blood safety and quality. If there was any legal action to be taken, which could involve a fine of up to £20,000 and or 6 months imprisonment, that would be levied against the chief executive and not the transfusion laboratory manager. So all I can say is that when you present the blood, the BCR, the blood compliance report to them for signing, that they're signing to say that they understand that they are taking responsibility for every aspect of blood safety and quality. That involves investigation, the effective and thorough investigation, even when that involves clinical areas. So yeah, it sounds easier said than done, but you need to educate clinical areas and senior management that blood safety and quality regulations takes priority against other trust rules for investigations, and therefore potential harm must be assessed.
Thank you. Someone's just put something to the chat. It would also be a good idea if more than one person's name can be the reporter. Sometimes transfusion practitioners are investigating along with the lead BMS. The TP has finished their investigation, the kappa, etc., and documented that. However, the BMS hasn't. If a TP is only named reporter, I'm guessing it's on Sabre, then they are then chased for information which is someone else's responsibility.
Okay, well, that's about how you manage your Sabre access. And although we have one main name, main account holder, that doesn't mean that you can't have other reporters listed. And so if you look at the top, there's a button that says manage reporters. You click that button and then you can list the names, roles, contact details of all the other people who are likely to report as part of your SABRE team. So when they're making reports, they can select their name rather than the name of the main account holder. Now, yes, it may well be that somebody makes the initial report, somebody else does the investigation. Therefore, you can use footnotes. Footnotes are there to update the report every stage up to and beyond putting in your confirmation report. So if it's appropriate for me to contact somebody else, put it in the footnote. Say, for the investigation, please contact so-and-so. So you simply use SABRE and the tools that are already available, and I can go to whoever if I need further information.
Is that right, Angela? Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. As I said, to put in a footnote who then should follow up the questions with a BMS, for example. Yeah. Another question from Annie Morrison, Scottish Blood Transfusion Services. I'm interested to know how we can write SOPs on blood administration within clinical areas, as this is out with Scottish Blood Transfusion Service and not our staff organisation to influence. Chris?
Well, again, it comes back to what I was saying about the chief executive or the trust, or in Scotland's case, the health board. They are the person that's responsible for blood safety and quality. I'm aware. Well, I'm aware. I don't fully understand the situation in Scotland, but there may be many people from England that don't understand. But in some hospitals, the transfusion laboratory services are provided by the Scottish National Blood Service, and they work within the hospitals, providing their blood, which is then used in the clinical areas. However, ultimate responsibility still relies on the health board itself. So if they are making errors, they need to take an active part in that investigation, and they need to take an active part in identifying the weaknesses and putting in place the corrective and preventive actions. Now, within the remit of the blood safety and quality regulations, we don't necessarily have influence over clinical practice, but we do have influence over quality and safety when it's affected by clinical staff. So up to the bedside. So that involves the collection of blood, the return of blood to storage, how blood is stored, investigations into reactions, etc., etc. Now, as I say, I also work or write for SHOT and part of their teams, and although they don't have any legal say in this, I'm sure that they would, rather people knew what they did in clinical areas, and when that they issue advice and checklists and things like that, that those are built into a quality system somehow, that means that people will do the right thing every time. I can't say clinical areas must have an SOP, but I can suggest that they do have an SOP, because with an SOP, you can plan the process, you can write instructions that tell people what to do, and by using a quality system approach, you can ensure a successful and safe outcome. If you don't have that and you simply rely on people's professional understanding and professional practice, you may have mistakes that are made that aren't controlled. So to answer Annie's question, it's you can use your influence as much as you can to help, but ultimately it's up to the chief executive of the health board or trust to take responsibility for aspects of the quality management system that affect blood safety and quality.
Thank you. Do you want to carry on, Chris? Yeah, just keep an eye on the time. And I think Beth and Emily have managed to do a fix on WhatsApp in the meantime. You're right to carry on.
Right. Okay. Yes, I mean, that was a fairly good point to break, because I finished the individual incident slides, and now we're on to the the last 10 or so slides about the actual data itself. So we want to monitor the errors that have been made, that we've reported, investigated, for the effectiveness and trend for recurrence over time. Again, it's not just a good thing to do, it's a requirement of the Good Practice Guide. A regular review of all significant deviations and non-conformances should be conducted, including their related investigations, to verify the effectiveness of the corrective and preventive actions taken. It helps us to group similar incidents together based on the type of incident or error that's occurred, or the type of root cause, or the area of improvement that was required. Can help the trending of similar errors, that you can focus on further areas of improvement. Looking at trending data, it could help provide early warning signals of more serious errors. So if you had an error that hasn't occurred before and then it starts to increase over a period of time, you might be able to nip that in the bud before it gets to a more catastrophic outcome. And to do this, we need to use categories, and it's probably advisable to use shot and sabre categories that already exist, but you can use any kind of categories for your own incidents as you wish. And I won't go through these slides, but the slides are here for people to read later on. These are the categories, the reaction categories that already exist from the blood safety and quality regulations. And it also includes categories for shot reportable reactions. I also categorize storage into different sections to reflect various aspects of storage that could go wrong. And I break down categorization of errors in laboratories to things like data entry, sample processing, component labeling, etc. Full details of how I categorize incidents are available in my chapter online in the shot report, and also including the shot categories as well. When it comes to making a report on SABRE, I'm not necessarily expecting you to get the right, if you can call it the right root cause or the correct category, because after I've reviewed it, I will change it to meet what's in your report anyway. The purpose of selecting the right event categories so that you can get the right shot questionnaire. But again, if you make a mistake, don't worry, that can be changed. And probably most importantly is I also break down the specification or root cause category to help identify the areas that might have gone wrong. So yes, it could be equipment failure. It could be, with justification, a slip or lapse in concentration by an individual, but it might well be an error that's occurred from training, from how the procedure is written, from how the process is designed, aspects to do with staffing, workload and skill mix, or the error could be the result of inadequate supervision. Again, I break down all of my incidents into those categories. You can have a look in the chapter as to how that works for the United Kingdom. So this is just some example data. The very first time I did a version of this presentation, I went to a particular hospital, and this was their live data up to about 2011. And this is just simply using Excel spreadsheets and presenting graphs. So if we looked at their data for a period of time, we might identify incorrect blood component issue. So selecting blood based on the wrong specific requirements is a significant problem for that hospital. So therefore, they may want to put more resource into investigating why those incidents are occurring. They also might want to look at their pre-transfusion testing errors, because that's the next biggest. They want to look at the root causes. You can see here that the biggest is inadequate process. So perhaps they've got a problem in how they design their processes. Perhaps there are fundamental problems with their quality system that's actually the root cause of the incidents having gone wrong. Also seem to have problem with staffing and workload issues. These errors down here, procedural steps omitted, wrong procedure performed incorrectly. As I said before, those slips and lapses, so they might be genuine, or it might well be because the investigation wasn't thorough enough and it just resulted in blaming an individual for their part in an error, not being vigilant enough, whereas a higher level of investigation might have uncovered aspects of the quality system for improvement. And again, a little bit more of a deeper dive, looking at incorrect blood components issued on its own. Yes, we can see it's quite likely to be down to inadequate design of the process and staffing and workload. You can do this for any category. As I say, this is just an example, and you can even do all of your instance for all of the root causes to pick out areas that need improvement. Now, that is all I have to say. So I'm quite happy for whatever time that we have left to answer questions on investigations, on reporting, other areas of blood safety and quality, which I might have some knowledge on, or I can at least take the question and get an answer at a later date. But thank you for listening, and I hope that was clear.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chris. You'll probably find there's going to be lots of questions coming in shortly. The first one is in chat. Could we have somewhere online we could see what information we need depending on the category of instance? Obviously, yeah, we've got the difference between save and shot, the questions they ask, and I do agree sometimes it is confusing with what information is needed.
Well, for the Sabre investigation, the most important thing is that we understand why the error occurred. And I was thinking about this, and it's quite simple. Those questions that we always ask: who, what, where, why, how. If you have answered those questions and put that in your report, then you're probably most of the way there. As I said, the most important thing is not just how the error occurred, but why did it occur? Why did the member of staff behave in the way that they did? Why did they do what they did? Had a conversation with somebody recently where I said, I can't close this down because all we've done is describe how the errors occurred. And I think it was a labelling error or something like that. So they said, well, we got a procedure and that they've been trained. So it was a human error. And I said, well, if they followed the procedure, they wouldn't have made a mistake. So why is it that they're not following the procedure? Why did they not check when they labelled the units that they put the labels on the right units? And if you've got verification software, why did they not use that? All those reasons as to why they behaved in the way they did is not due to a slip or lapse or concentration. It's indicative of a problem with the quality system. Now, they may be that they've missed out those steps, or when they did check, they may have got the check wrong because they're trying to struggle with low staffing numbers or a high workload or multiple distractions. So work out why it is that they didn't follow the procedure, and you're more than likely to get a report that I can close down.
Thank you. There's another one in the chat there about regarding staffing as a human factor. Yeah, valid point. Reassess contingency plan. Would be part of the review process. But yes, all labs, all transfusion settings, hospitals, TPs, and blood services, we are under a lot of staffing pressures and training demands. So is there anything else that can be done?
Well, in terms of reporting, if those are factors that have affected the error and the reasons why the error was made, then it's valid that you note that and put it down in the report. If you put that down in the report then I would need to know what it is that you're doing about it. So it may well be that you've got adverts out, that you're in the process of appointing staff, you've got some trainees that you are trying to train up. So all that is useful information that let me know that you're going through the right steps to try and address the problems that have caused the error in the first place. So that would be useful information. I might be able to close down incident based on that. But also, if you have vacancies and you haven't got adverts out, or that you haven't attracted qualified staff, again, tell me. But also, how are you mitigating against the error? Are you looking at when work comes in? For example, if you've got a clinic that sends you samples at 6 o'clock at night when there's only 1 or 2 members of staff on, is there any way that you can influence that clinic to get the samples in during the day when there's more staff around? Or perhaps you could extend the shifts so that there's more people later on. I'm not saying there's only one way to do it. It's about thinking outside the box and trying to think of novel ways of addressing the problems with the resource that you have available.
Thank you. Another one that I agree with is the lack of details come back from clinical areas, which sort of links to the previous one about potential and actual harm. They're based on actual. We just get minimal reports back. It's more of a statement, really, isn't it? But I think all hospitals will struggle to get full reports back from clinical areas if they're still based on actual harm.
Yes, I am aware of that particular problem. As I said before, it's about education of clinical areas, about the importance of doing it, why it's done, because we want to identify prevention rather than treating, or managing the outcomes of errors that have already been made. It's a responsibility of the chief executive or of the health board or the trust. You can lead a horse to water.
So somebody followed on from that one. If the investigation is poor or does not address the error, what is expected from the transfusion team to do? So we can keep on going back and keep on asking for more. You can escalate it to the governance leads, but we do eventually hit a sort of a brick wall, which is very frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I will probably try 2-3 times maximum to get, I don't mean this as a pun, but blood out of a stone. If I'm not getting the information, then I have to close down the report based on that lack of information. But that lack of information is noted by myself. It is information and intelligence which is passed on to the inspectorate, and it is information that forms part of the process of selecting sites for inspection.
And hospitals, they shouldn't really record that within their own internal investigation. They've escalated it to these levels and they have all that evidence that would help them as well. I don't know if you can answer this one, but just out of interest, how many incidents do you get reported to Sabre on an average day, say, that are not excluded? Are you allowed to mention that?
I've just distracted myself. I've noticed it's my stepdaughter's birthday a couple of days ago. I've just noticed the birthday balloons are behind me.
Been there the whole time.
Yes, I'm not weird. I just didn't notice. Sorry, what was the question? Oh, how many? I'd say around about 30 or 40 incidents are reported every day. Barring weekends, although some reports do come in. I'd say on an annual basis, around about 4,500 incident reports come through on Sabre, and about a third of those, or a quarter of those roughly, so about 1,100, 1,200 reports are reportable under the blood safety and quality regulations. That's events up to about 600, 700, 800 reactions. So probably about half of the incidents that are reported are shot-only incidents. Half of them are reported as a part of the regulation.
And are there any examples of what is not being reported to SABR by hospitals that have been found on inspections? A common theme that perhaps we're not fully aware we should be reporting these?
It's difficult to say what hasn't been reported if it's not been reported, but what I will say is that it's clear that any category of incident, well, the categories exist based on the reports that have been made. So every type of incident that could be made has been made, and that's how I form my categories. But not every hospital reports the same categories that other hospitals do. Not something that I can necessarily address. I can't go up to a low reporter and say, well, why aren't you reporting these? Because they could turn around and say, well, because we're actually very good at what we do, rather than, you know, we didn't know that we had to report these, or we're trying to hide information. All I can ask is that people look at my chapter, look at the types of things that should be reported, do a gap analysis between what's in the chapter and what incidents are raised and which ones they choose for reporting, and then perhaps, you know, ask me for advice as to whether they should be reporting certain things if they find that they're not. Sometimes it's not appropriate to report every incident. What we don't want is to reproduce your quality system or quality incident management system in SABR, because that would be a waste of your time, a waste of my time. Just want the ones that qualify as serious, and people's perceptions on serious might differ. For example, a very small hospital that only accepts a few samples every week, if they have a sample processing error where they've accepted a sample that they should have rejected, they may want to report that as a one-off incident. Whereas a larger hospital, a trust covering a large area, they transfuse 30,000 units every year. One sample processing error, yes, it's an adverse event, but is it serious? Because they've, you know, perhaps noticed it. They can manage that within their quality system. And so it's about being subjective. It's about looking at the risk of accepting one sample when you accept 60,000 samples every year. It's not so bad. But if you're only issuing 100 odd units every year, then an incorrect sample is a bigger risk. If it's a bigger risk, probably needs reporting.
Thank you. Two more questions in the chat. One is about resources, use of the old limbs, which are restricted for what they can actually do. Apart from getting new limbs, which is a massive procurement exercise, what can be done in the meantime to overcome that? Have you come across any examples of what other hospitals have implemented?
It's difficult to say. My background isn't within a transfusion laboratory. It's more to do with blood establishment. I am aware that there are many different versions of limbs, and that limb systems are configured independently of each other, and so they may work slightly differently. All I can say is that your quality management system needs to assure the quality and safety of the blood that's been issued to that patient, and that can be a mixture of using equipment, software, and manual processes. I can't tell you how to do that. That's not within the remit of the MHRA, and it's not within my area of expertise or experience anyway. But the basics are, as long as you have every aspect of the quality system covered by software, equipment, and manual processes, if it is robust, it will be compliant. But for you, I guess it's about identifying the gaps, identifying the risks, identifying the problems, and putting in manual processes that mitigate those particular hot topics. Yeah.
And what we had done, we've actually got like, when we issue blood, we've got like a manual paper check form. So our limbs may not be sufficient, so we brought that in. So that's a prompt that we have in our departments that may be useful there. There was one, which where was it, about the PSURF? Gone.
I did wonder when the PSURF question.
Yeah, so I was one of those as well. Where does it come from? Yes, for those who don't know, it's a patient safety incident review framework. So it's come from Central NHS offices, isn't it? So they're moving away from the root cause analysis, which is different to the MHRA. So if you're right to answer this one.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. It has cropped up a number of times before, and there is a position statement that is available on the SHOT website. So investigate that. It's a document that has been produced in conjunction with NHS England, SHOT and MHRA. Now, we don't have any control over another arm's length body such as NHS England with how they approach the investigation of clinical incidents. However, as I've stated a number of times, the blood safety and quality regulations exist in law, and therefore that you must be compliant with them as a trust or health board. And the problems come with the terminology of root cause. When we talk about root cause, all we are doing is stating what is it that went wrong, why did it go wrong. We are not prescribing that you have to go through any formal root cause analysis or formal process that you may have undertaken with the trust before. It's just a term to identify what it is that went wrong. Now, that's the difference in that the language used may be confusing, but the principles are the same. PSERF wants you to take a systems approach, and that's what I've tried to get across within this presentation, is that systems, the same as your quality management system or process, it's looking at what it is that you do. And when you look at a process, you have to look at the human factors. Human factors, Alison Watt from SHOT will tell you that another name for human factors is ergonomics. It's about making sure that processes work. And so if you are identifying why it is that that process has failed and putting in improvements to that process that make your components safer, that make the patient outcome safer, then we're talking about the same thing. We're unfortunately just using different language because we can't change the wording that is in blood safety and quality regulations. We can't change the wording that is within the good practice guide, but what we can do is stress that the principles are the same in improving the processes that staff perform.
And just to add the link to the report, which is very easy readings actually in the chat, if people want to have a look at that, the link on the SHOT website. Sort of linked into that, are any good sources of information for further reading for people, especially investigating them? So I know we're trying to set something nationally for sort of the national lab managers, and obviously TP's got their forums of, like, especially the new lab managers coming through, a support network. But are there any good resources on the web that would help?
Well, my interest makes me sound rather dull. My interest in human factors and human error was when I worked as a quality officer at the National Blood Service. So that takes me back prior to 2005, when my role included health and safety. It's a joint role, health and safety and quality within the blood service. And assessing incident reports, people were constantly saying, it's only human error. There's nothing you can do about human error. And so I went to the Health and Safety Executive website, and I haven't been there for a number of years, but that's where I picked up all my knowledge, and a lot of my tools is from that website. It has been updated. They do talk about human factors rather than human error, but the principles are the same, is that the human error is a result of factors that affect their behaviour. So I would go there. I don't know off the top of my head of other resources. I'm sure they are available. All you have to do is to use your preferred search engine for human factors and route around. That's, yeah, I can do this, although I've obviously presented to a number of people today, and many people may have seen this presentation before. if there are any colleagues who haven't been available, then contact me and I can arrange a smaller session and do this presentation as well. Or if you are stuck, then just give me a ring or send me an email. If you've got any particular problems with particular incidents, then I would rather have a report which I can close that's easy reading. So if you need help, just ask for it.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to ask that. Can we contact you? We don't want to flood you with emails and phone calls, but that's appreciated. Are there any other questions, comments from anybody else? Stick them in the chat. If not, you get some of your morning back to go back to work if you're lucky.
Or have a longer lunch.
SHOT resources for human factors. Yes, thank you, Jenny. Yes, on the SHOT website, there is human factors information on there as well. Yeah,
sorry, Jenny, I should have pointed people to that. I overlooked it. But yes, SHOT's also very good for its resources as well.
Well, on that note, may wrap it up then. If there's nothing else coming through, I'm just keeping an eye on it, but nothing else. So thank you very much, Chris, for your time.
Well, thank you for setting this up.
Yeah, no, very helpful, very informative, and hopefully a lot of people taking notes away to start improving on our investigations and CAPA. So thank you very much.